Peace be upon you. He was asking me about the topic of multi-detector CT, and he was asking me if I had seen information about the difference when I say that I have a multi-detector CT, for example, 16 slices or 64 or 30, or for example, 60 slices or 64 or 30. In 128, the detector configuration can be different. Or for example, I can work with 8 rows of detector or 4 rows of detector or whatever the number of detectors is. Is that the question, or am I misunderstanding? That's right, doctor. The whole idea is that when I have any machine in the city, I might have, for example, 128 or even up to 320 rows of detectors. However, the detector configuration refers to how many rows of detectors you will use during imaging. It's not necessary to use all 320 rows. For instance, for CT brain, CT abdomen, CT triphasic, or CT angiography, you might use a configuration like 320 multiplied by 1 millimeter, meaning you are talking about 320 meters per rotation at 1 millimeter. This is in case you want to perform cardiac imaging. But if you want to do something else, you might be told to use a different configuration, like 64 rows. So I would work with 64 or 64 out of 320 using a different detector configuration. For example, using 64 rows of detectors instead of 320. This is what I call detector configuration, but in my environment, I actually have 320. If I wanted to give you an opportunity on the same sites, the machine itself will give you options. For example, you can work with 64 multiplied by 1 millimeters or multiplied by 0.5 meters, or you can work with 32 or 16. This is also part of the detector configuration. You can work with 4, or you can work with 32, or you can work with 16. These are options available on the machine. Basically, it reduces what you are working on, and at the same time, the goal is by, if you are working on something, for example, you might need something that is very large, and it tells you that you can use less. In this case, it will be very large, and it tells you that you can use less. So there will be no exposure to the patients, and at the same time, you will get the same image quality that you want. So it's about having the different medical options available for you to work with. But I have. And you are working on the available options, meaning most of the devices in the market, for example, or it might tell you that it doesn't work. For instance, it tells you that you have 128 rows of detectors, but in reality, you are working with 64 rows. The detector configuration you will find is adjusted to the 128 protocols. But I'm sorry, 64. The 128 might only be applicable in cases like cardiac imaging or certain specific cases. That's the only time it might work with you at 128. Is that right, doctor? Or is there more? Thank you, doctor. We talked last time, and we are still continuing, God willing, our discussion about ultrasound. Today, God willing, we will continue talking about the modes of ultrasound and the physics of Doppler imaging. One of the doctors also spoke to me about the topic of contrast media in ultrasound, and we need to explain it, God willing, when we discuss harmonic imaging and compound imaging. God willing, we will have tomorrow's lecture on ultrasound artifacts, and then hopefully we will have completed the ultrasound topic. We will have the advantage of magnetic resonance imaging and nuclear imaging. These will be present. If there are any missing topics in the previous comments, such as quality assurance in X-ray modalities, we will discuss it in the lecture. This might be addressed in the minutes, God willing, or in the minutes, God willing. It is not important because it is not related to you, but we will get an idea about it or explain the content regarding the topic of ultrasound when we return and discuss. We talked about the topic of ultrasound and understood the interactions in ultrasound. We discussed beam formation and what the transducer is, how the ultrasound pulse is emitted, and the process of receiving the signal, as well as how it is designed on the ponderous or the LLL or the LLL, and everything that happens through the process of ultrasound. So when I come to talk about it, I will find that I have in the three main modes are A mode, B mode, and M mode. These three are the main imaging modes. A mode is used in certain cases. Its concept relies on producing something called one-dimensional data. This means that the data I have or the data I generate and receive is considered one-dimensional. When you work on an image or a recorded received image, that image is two-dimensional. However, if I am working on data, the output data is in the form of a spectrum, not an image. Therefore, I consider this data to be one-dimensional. One-dimensional means it represents data coming from a certain point, providing me with information about one direction. Now let's explain this simply. If I have, as we see in the image, a broad transducer, if I place it on the eye, okay, inside the eye, I have something present, all right? We'll say it's like we see here, 12, 3, 4, 5, as we see here. These layers, each having the ability to reflect the signal or the ultrasound pulse coming to them, return the signal. The idea in ultrasound is that I have the ultrasound, which transmits the pulse. This pulse undergoes transmission within the tissues present, leading to various interactions. If it encounters less than its threshold, it will reflect, and the transducer will start to receive this signal and translate it. Reflection occurs, okay? Of course, it depends on the subject in between. So if I have here, as I see, and I have, for example, my ultrasound pulse coming, reflection will happen from point 1. Okay, this is the intensity or the ultrasound pulse that I transmitted. When it returned to me with amplitude or experienced a loss in its intensity, it resulted in a loss in intensity, as we discussed earlier. The attenuation that occurs in the pulse is the attenuation that happens, or the loss that occurs in the pulse that enters the patient's body and returns. There is a reduction in intensity, meaning a reduction in amplitude. If we remember together, this is the shape of the pulse regarding amplitude, which is the peak, the length of the peak. The reduction means it decreases. Instead of having a high amplitude like this, the peak starts to drop. However, it maintains the same frequency. If I send a certain frequency, the frequency that will return to me or be received will be the same frequency. What does the same frequency mean? It means, okay, now I have received the signal. This signal took time to reach number 2 and to return. Now I have the relationship where I say that distance equals speed. I apologize, speed equals distance over time. I apologize for the speed, distance over time. Distance over time remains equal to speed multiplied by time. So what benefit do I get from distance? I want to determine the location of the layer, where the layer is located, from which I receive the ultrasound pulse. I will send my pulse and receive it back. How much time did it take? It took time going and returning, which is 2 times the time. Therefore, if I want to calculate the distance, it will be equal to 2 times time times speed. So c is known, which I mentioned earlier, which is 1540 centimeters per second, the speed of the average velocity in these tissues. This is the average speed for me. So this is the speed and time. I determine how long the signal took to go and how long it took to return, so I have the distance. Great. I will take this signal and start recording it on the scale in front of me, which represents the strength of the signal. Signal number 1 came early, so I recorded it as early, or in relation to me, it is still my signal. Signal number 2 was followed by signal number 3, which was followed by signal number 4, which was followed by signal number 5. So in this case, I have recorded all the incoming data based on its time and organized it. Okay. Great. Now I know how long each one is coming in or how long after. So I know the order of what I have. I know the order of what I have. Sorry, let someone in. Okay, now I know the order of what I have. If I have a layer among these that has a problem or is missing, then my reflected intensity or reflected pulse will be what? It will be attenuated or missing, or I have the distances between each pulse and the other. There should be a distance present. For example, if something happens like what is present in the brain, if I am doing something and it looks like this, for example, here there is no shift, but if there is a shift, you will find that your signal has undergone shifting in this way. Well, based on what you have done and identified regarding the signal, if something happens, for example, in a case where they call it retinal detachment, it's essentially speaking the same idea. You can determine through your signal if it has moved from its original location in the eye. You can identify the problem that exists, such as, okay, I will find what appears in the shapes. You will find that there is an area with it. Here, there is nothing at all. After that, the signal started to rise again. The higher your signal is, the more it comes from strength. However, this area means that there are no reflectors between it and the first one, which is at this point, and the second one at that point. This area is considered a place where there are no reflectors to create a reflection for the ultrasound pulse. This figure shows you the spectrum for A mode. This figure shows you the spectrum for A mode. This figure shows you the spectrum for A mode. This figure shows you the spectrum for A mode. This figure shows you the spectrum for A mode. This figure shows you the spectrum for A mode. Later, the signal that arrives very early is considered very important for you. The earlier the signal arrives, the more significant it is in this case, as this signal is coming from a relevant source for you. All right, here it essentially represents that whenever yours looks like this, it means it hasn't changed significantly. So yours is strong, or it can reflect on this. This is the same thing. This is the appearance of the high A mode that is on the reflector. Breath, his speech shapes any view. You will find here the pixels that represent this area. And then here is the response area that represents this region. Then the other pixels appear. And this pixel also represents the image or anatomy related to the eye. A mode, B mode, and M mode are discussed. B mode is brightness mode. A mode is amplitude. B mode is brightness. M mode is motion. Mobile phones, which are essential in our daily lives, have transformed the way we communicate, providing instant connectivity and access to information. The B mode is a 2D mode, and it's the same concept we discussed last time. I have a transducer that sends ultrasound waves, which get reflected and come back. Here you start working on your depth or your axis. There it was giving you the spectrum shape like this. This spectrum was the depth. You're walking like this, so this is exactly yours. You're indeed walking like this, which definitely means this is it for you. All right. Okay. The same idea of reflected intensity is that if you receive a higher reflected intensity, you categorize it as a hyperechoic signal. If you receive a lower intensity, it becomes a hypoechoic signal, or it could be ISO, or in the case of no signal, it is the unechoic signal. Depending on the reflected intensity, you start to represent this intensity and assign it its brightness, thus representing your image in this way. Of course, this is certainly, undoubtedly, and indeed an extremely beautiful ultrasound mode that is known for its clarity and precision in medical imaging. The idea behind motion mode is that you rely on motion, meaning there is movement occurring. You are imaging organs that move over time. Therefore, you want to achieve motion, to see the velocity if you are dealing with a valve in the heart, for example, and you want to observe its movement. If you want to see what is happening, you want to capture that movement. It's as if you are recording this motion, as if you are taking a snapshot of the movement, the comprehensive history of movement. So what you start doing is taking our regular 2D image, and then you begin to create a straight line or take a single line at a specific location, at a place where there is a valve or where there is something moving or the anatomy that you want to detect. It will start giving you the spectrum in this way, and it will start giving you the wave in this form. If you notice here from the shape, you will find a wave shape here and a static or linear shape here that is not moving. Why? Because on the line you created, this line contains every point, every pixel present within it. You are telling it, I want every point, so study its movement, study the change that occurred in the reflected intensity at this point in the reflected intensity of the ultrasound pulse at this location over time. So you have the scale on the x-axis, which is time, and on the y-axis you have the amplitude. Thus, the signal appears in this way, meaning it is changing. So let's assume this layer or pixel is the area that is moving or has movement. With the movement, it changes and it starts to show you. But if you have an area with no movement, it will appear like this, similar to the first one. It is a straight line with no movement, so it appears this way. On the other hand, the wave shape you see represents the movement of the points you have selected or the selected pixels you want to study for your motion. The same applies here. This part is static for me, while this part is in motion. Here, of course, for me, it is about the movement you are making, meaning here or there, and here you are inside a body or entering. So this represents for you what it means or what it represents for me. We come to the topic in the main mode, 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 in the main mode. In the idea of ultrasound imaging, you send a signal or send an ultrasound pulse and receive it at the same frequency, but with different amplitudes, different intensities, and different strengths. However, in the Doppler effect, you rely on a frequency change. You send an ultrasound pulse, and this ultrasound pulse interacts in a specific way. This interaction returns the pulse at a different frequency, allowing you to calculate something called Doppler shift or frequency shift. What does frequency shift or Doppler shift mean? It means the frequency that I sent has shifted, meaning the one I transmitted. The difference in frequencies that I receive gives me information. From this information, I can determine the direction of the moving object. Let's assume it deals with the Doppler shift or focuses more on blood flow. If you are measuring blood flow or want to measure the direction of the blood or the arteries present in the veins or arteries, you want to see their direction and their intensity. Is there an area with higher blood flow, or if you want to see its velocity? All right. Where can I get this information? You can obtain it by sending Signals. Normally, you send a constant signal and it remains constant, but here there is a moving object. So, let's understand how this variable frequency you received occurred. The concept is quite simple. Imagine a car with a specific siren sound while you are standing still. The sound you hear is at a constant frequency, and there is no change in the sound intensity for you. This is the normal situation we work with. Now, if the car starts moving, what happens? You will hear the sound coming from a distance, and as it approaches, you will notice that the sound increases in intensity. Why does the sound increase? It means the number of cycles per second is increasing, and the energy has increased because the car is getting closer to you. This movement causes the waves to change. Let's delve deeper into this phenomenon. When the car is stationary, the sound waves it emits are evenly spaced, reaching your ears at regular intervals. However, as the car begins to move towards you, these sound waves become compressed, arriving at your ears more frequently. This compression of sound waves is what leads to the increase in frequency and intensity that you perceive. The closer the car gets, the more pronounced this effect becomes. This is a classic example of the Doppler effect, which is a change in frequency or wavelength of a wave in relation to an observer who is moving relative to the wave source. The Doppler effect is not only applicable to sound waves but also to electromagnetic waves such as light. In the case of light, this effect can cause a shift towards the blue end of the spectrum as the source approaches, known as a blue shift, or towards the red end as it moves away, known as a red shift. Understanding this concept is crucial in various fields, including astronomy, where it helps in determining the movement and distance of celestial objects. All right, there's a wave coming behind it. So, the body that emits this wave is moving, and what happens is that it creates a time difference between the first wave that reaches the listener and the second wave that comes after it. This time difference decreases because the body is moving. Instead of receiving a certain frequency, because of this movement, the frequency increases. This means that the cycles of the waves are getting closer together, so the wavelength between them is affected. What happens to the wavelength? It decreases. Okay, in this case, the frequency increases. So if the frequency increases, when the frequency has increased, it means you were supposed to hear it. So what happened then? I got it. In the frequency, I call it what is in the frequency. So you experienced a positive Doppler shift, which means you observed a shift in the positive direction. What is the reason for this? It is because the source that was emitting the sound was moving towards you. This is the same concept that occurs in the arteries or blood flow with the transducer. If I have a transducer like this, and it is moving in the same direction, I will find that the frequency I receive will be higher than the frequency I sent, and I call this the Doppler shift. If my Arabic is going in the opposite direction, moving away from me, what will happen? The same idea applies. I feel like there is a loss of sound, meaning I am losing the ability to hear the sound significantly. Why? The same concept applies to the gap between cycles or waves. The wavelength will start to increase, and the distances between the peaks will begin to grow, causing the frequency to decrease. In this case, you will experience a negative shift. So, if you are moving away, the same idea applies to blood flow. If the direction of blood flow is coming towards you, then you will experience a negative shift. This means that the frequency in relation to you will be negative. This gives you information that, in this case, you can determine through the value of the frequency. Now let's consider a case where you are standing still, there is no problem, and the frequency here is the same for both. In this case, both are 0. They are the same. Here, you are moving in your direction, so that's fine. Now, you are moving away from it, which means you have a Doppler shift. Moving away from the transducer, you have a negative 20 Hertz in reduction. If there is no change in the level, the user experiences a longer period of passing. If the level changes, the user experiences a longer period of passing than the passing itself, then the passing decreases.